July 27th, 1656. That is the date on the document. The document was read aloud inside the Talmud Torah synagogue in Amsterdam. The men who gathered to hear it were members of the Ma'amad, the governing council of the Portuguese-Jewish congregation that had built its life in the Dutch Republic. The document begins, "The lords of the Ma'amad, having long known of the evil opinions and acts of Baruch de Spinoza, have endeavored by various means and promises to turn him from his evil ways." Evil ways, evil opinions. The document continues. It speaks of abominable heresies which he practiced and taught, and monstrous deeds. Abominable heresies. Monstrous deeds. Now I want you to do something. I want you to read past those words, past the language about heresies and evil ways and monstrous deeds. Read it the way Spinoza himself taught us to read anything, without the frame the institution hands you. Ask what the document actually says, not what you expect it to say given the words it opens with. It names not one heresy, not one deed, not one person harmed, not one teaching quoted, not one action described, not one sentence of his that anyone found dangerous enough to put on paper. The most severe writ of excommunication in the recorded history of that congregation, with language like abominable, monstrous, evil, the full weight of religious authority behind every word, and it contains not a single specific act. A man of 23 years old, Baruch de Spinoza, expelled forever. For something the document will not say, that is where this story begins, not with a heresy, with an absence. And the absence, once you understand what kind of institution produced it and why, is more revealing than any specific accusation could have been. The document tells you in its silence exactly what they feared. It feared a direction, a destination, something this young man had not yet finished saying, and they expelled him before he could finish saying it. 14 years later, he finished saying it. In a book published under no name in a city that wasn't the city named on the cover, he said everything. All of it. And everything he said proved that they were right to be afraid of the direction his thinking was heading. Stay with me, because this is a story about what happens when an institution can sense where a mind is going before it arrives, and decides to close the door before the man gets through it. There is something I need to explain about what the word expelled meant in Amsterdam in 1656. Not excluded from a social club, not asked to find a different congregation. Something more total than either of those, in ways that are difficult to fully register from inside a world where religious affiliation is mostly optional. The congregation Talmud Torah was a Sephardic Portuguese-Jewish community. Its members were converso families, people who had converted outwardly to Catholicism in Portugal and Spain to survive the Inquisition, who had lived for generations as nominal Catholics while maintaining Jewish practice in private, at enormous personal risk. Some of them had watched family members condemned by the Inquisition. Some had relatives who had been executed. When they finally reached Amsterdam, where the Dutch Republic's relative tolerance allowed them to practice openly, they had rebuilt everything from nothing. A community, a language, a set of laws and practices and shared obligations, a way of being in the world. They were intensely aware that their continued presence in the Netherlands depended on being seen by the Dutch authorities as orderly, respectable, non-subversive members of civil society. A community of former secret Jews who had fled persecution could not afford a prominent member whose ideas made the whole congregation look like a source of dangerous unorthodoxy. The eyes that had watched them in Lisbon and Seville were not entirely gone. They knew it. The cherem, the writ of excommunication, was their enforcement mechanism. And the one issued against Spinoza on July 27, 1656, was the harshest in the recorded history of that congregation. Stephen Nadler, whose biography of Spinoza remains among the most careful in the scholarly literature, has documented its terms. 70 conditions of exclusion, permanent and total. 70 conditions. No member of the community could speak to him, not write to him, not do business with him, not live under the same roof, not come within 2 meters of his body, not read anything he had written. His children, if he ever had any, were barred from the community's schools. And when he died, He was 23 and the document assumed he would die eventually. He would have no claim to burial in Jewish ground. His name would not be spoken in memorial prayer. The community of the dead would be as close to him as the community of the living. For a young man whose entire social world, whose business relationships, whose daily language and rhythm and identity had been constructed inside that congregation from birth, this was not a punishment, it was erasure. They were not removing him from a privilege, they were removing him from existence as they defined it. And still the document said nothing specific about what he had done. Think about that for a second. The most extreme social death this community could pronounce. A young man cut off from everything that had constituted his life, and on paper, nothing, not one sentence to explain why. Spinoza knew what the cherem could do to a man. He had watched it work. There was a man in the same congregation, an older man gone from the world by the time the cherem against Spinoza was pronounced, but not gone from memory, whose story Spinoza would have known from childhood. Uriel da Costa, born in Porto, to a converso family, raised Catholic, emigrated to Amsterdam as a young man seeking the Jewish identity he had constructed from reading the Hebrew Bible in secret. He arrived expecting to find a community whose beliefs matched what he had imagined. What he found was a community with its own rules and its own hierarchy and its own intolerance of deviation, different in form from the Catholic Church he had fled, but recognizable in function. Da Costa was excommunicated twice from the same congregation. The first time he submitted, he apologized. He performed whatever recantation was required. The community let him back. He had thought his way to conclusions he could not unthink. Conclusions about the soul, about the authority of rabbinic tradition, about what the Hebrew Bible actually said versus what institutions claimed it said, but he swallowed them. For a while, he could not stop thinking. The questions kept arriving. The second cherem came in 1640. This time, the community brought him back under conditions that were not readmission. They were a demonstration of what the institution could require of a man who had tested its patience. He was brought to the synagogue. He read his confession aloud before the assembled congregation. Then he was given 39 lashes across his bare back. Then he was made to lie down flat across the threshold of the synagogue, face against the stone floor, while every member of the community filed out, stepped over his body, walked across him, including by some accounts members of his own family. He went home that evening and wrote a document he called The Examination of Pharisaic Traditions, a bitter defense of his life and his thinking, a reckoning with what had just been done to him. Shortly afterward, he shot himself. Baruch de Spinoza was 8 years old when Uriel da Costa died in that way. His father was a respected member of the same congregation. Spinoza grew up in the same neighborhood, attended the same schools, lived inside the same community that had made Uriel da Costa walk to the synagogue, knowing what was waiting for him inside. He knew that story. He had grown up breathing the air of a community that was capable of it. He was 23 when they came for him. He did not lie down. The document does not name the heresies, but scholars have spent 370 years working backward from the evidence that does exist, and a coherent picture emerges. Not certain, not directly documented, but coherent enough to see the shape of what the Mamad was afraid of. Spinoza was working as a tutor to the sons of families in the congregation. He was young, intellectually restless, reading widely in the Latin philosophy his community's schools had given him access to. Some of the young men he tutored began asking questions, or began repeating questions they had discussed with him that their families found alarming. Questions about whether the soul survived the body's death. Questions about whether the Torah had been authored by God or by Moses. Questions about what it meant for Israel to be called a chosen people, if God was not a personal lawgiver who made decisions about particular tribes in particular centuries. A philosopher named Juan de Prado arrived in Amsterdam around 1655, roughly when the Mamad began taking its first steps toward action against Spinoza. Several years after the cherem, a Spanish Inquisition investigation gathered testimony from witnesses who had encountered both men in Amsterdam. 2 witnesses reported independently that Prado and Spinoza had discussed openly, in conversation, not in writing, nothing that could be seized and read, that the soul dies with the body, and that the Torah is a human document. This is the reconstruction historians work from, not Spinoza's own words, which do not survive from this period, but what others said about him, to investigators who had their own interests in the testimony. The picture that emerges is of a young man who was asking questions in the wrong direction. Not questions about practice, questions about foundation. The kind of questions that, followed to their conclusion, would require you to say that the entire structure rests on human authority dressed as divine authority. Now here is the detail that reveals everything about what the congregation actually feared. Before they issued the cherem, the leaders of the Ma'amad made Spinoza an offer, a pension, 1,000 florins per year, a substantial sum for a 23-year-old in 17th century Amsterdam, in exchange for one simple thing. He did not have to recant anything. He did not have to publicly apologize. He did not even have to believe differently. He only had to appear in the synagogue on occasion and maintain silence about his ideas in public. They were not trying to correct a heretic. They were trying to buy silence from a thinker they could already see was dangerous, not for what he had said, for what he was going to say next. He refused. Nadler writes that such deliberate hypocrisy was abhorrent to Spinoza's nature. He would not perform a belonging he had already ceased to feel. He would not accept money to stand in a building and be publicly something he was privately not. He turned down 1,000 florins a year rather than pretend. When I read that the first time, something in me went very quiet. The cherem was pronounced. Spinoza left. He did not appeal it. He did not write a defense for the congregation. He did not seek reinstatement, did not approach members of the Ma'amad, did not attempt to negotiate the terms. He simply went. First to the outskirts of Amsterdam, staying in the countryside with sympathetic friends. Then around 1660 or 1661 to Rijnsburg, a small village near Leiden, where a community of collegians, a tolerant Protestant group with no clergy, no creed, no building, and no interest in policing anyone's beliefs, offered him a quiet place to work. He lived simply in rented rooms. He taught a small circle of students. He corresponded with philosophers across Europe through trusted intermediaries. And he ground lenses. Spinoza was a skilled artisan in optical glass. He made microscope lenses and telescope lenses by hand, each one shaped and polished with grinding tools he partly designed himself, shaped to precise curvatures that required sustained attention and the kind of patience that is really a form of discipline applied to the body. He sold enough to live on. He was offered academic positions at several universities, including a professorship at Heidelberg. He turned them all down. He did not want any institution to have a claim on what he thought or what he said. He accepted a small pension from a friend, Jan de Witt, because de Witt was a man he trusted, and because the pension came without conditions. The man, expelled for seeing with too much clarity, spent the rest of his life fabricating instruments that helped others see more clearly. I have turned that over more times than I can count, and while he was grinding lenses, he was writing. In the manuscripts that circulated in the 1660s among trusted friends, what would later be called the short treatise on God, man, and his well-being, you can already see the architecture of everything the congregation had tried to prevent. God is not a personal lawgiver. The soul does not survive the body. The Torah was written by human beings for human purposes. Religious institutions serve a social function, but that function is not the same thing as truth. And the institution that conflates the two is protecting itself, not the people inside it. He wrote all of this in a rented room, with fine glass dust on his hands, in the methodical silence of a man who had already made his peace with the expulsion and was simply continuing to work. The institution had cast him out. He had kept going. I want to tell you something I have not spoken about much on this channel, because it is the part of this story that landed in me in a particular way. There was a period of close to a year, not long after I stepped down as deacon, not long after the reading and the questions had accumulated past the point where I could contain them inside the structure I had lived inside for decades, when I was in a kind of middle place. I had not left. I had not announced anything. I had pulled back from the formal roles, had told my pastor quietly and without drama that I needed to step away from leadership, but I was still showing up, still going to the social events, still stopping to talk with people whose names and families I knew, as well as I knew my own. There was a Tuesday evening in November. Bare tree time, grey sky, the cold before the real cold sets in. When I drove to the church for a committee meeting, I had no real reason to attend. I had been on the email chain for years, force of habit. I drove over. I sat in the parking lot. 40 minutes, maybe more. The lights were on inside. I could see movement through the windows, familiar shapes, people I had sat beside for decades at more meetings than I could name. I could hear, very faintly, voices, not words, just the sound of people talking in a room I could see but not enter. I could not make myself go in. I don't think I decided not to. I think I just sat there until the decision made itself. The big overhead lights in the parking lot came on, those sodium vapor lights that start orange and take a few minutes to warm to their full pale yellow, and I was still sitting in the car looking at the lit windows of that building. At some point, without ceremony, I started the engine and drove home. Nobody had seen me pull in. Nobody called that evening. The absences would accumulate over the following weeks until people started to notice, and then there would be the small, cold shoulders at the hardware store, the deliberate looking away in parking lots, the conversations that stopped when I walked in. But that was later. That Tuesday, it was just me in a car with the engine running and the heater coming on, looking at a building I had given 22 years to and could no longer enter. No drama, no confrontation, no statement, just a man sitting in a parking lot until the lights came on, and then driving home. I think about Spinoza on the day after the cherem was pronounced. The document had been read. The community had declared its verdict. He had refused the 1,000 florins. He packed what he needed and walked away from everything that had constituted his daily life. His language, his neighborhood, his business relationships, the community of practice that had shaped every habit of his mind since childhood. Not in rage, not in some defiant public gesture. There is no record of him making a speech, writing an open letter to the congregation, seeking an audience to hear his defense. He simply left, at 23, with what he could carry. I'm not claiming equivalence between what he did and what I did. He lost everything. I lost a committee seat and a few acquaintances who now cross the street. The stakes are not in the same order of magnitude, but that specific quality, the moment when you realize that fighting, appealing, explaining, performing the belonging one more time would require you to be something you are no longer able to be. That quality, I understand. You do not argue with something that cannot contain you anymore. You just leave. Now I want to tell you what Spinoza did with the next 14 years. In 1670, a book appeared. Technically, it appeared in Hamburg, under a false publisher's name with no author listed. The city of printing was hidden. The author's name was hidden. The man who wrote it understood that every institution it touched would treat it as a weapon aimed at themselves, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish. And he was not wrong. He had spent enough years watching institutions protect their foundations to know exactly what he was doing. The book was the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. The argument at its center was not subtle. It was precise, methodical, and devastating in the way that only genuinely careful thinking can be devastating. Spinoza argued that the Bible is a human document. He did not argue this as an insult. He argued it as a conclusion forced by the evidence inside the text itself, evidence available to anyone willing to read, without the protective frame the institution had installed between the reader and the words on the page. The evidence was this. Open Genesis chapter 1. God creates in 6 days, animals before humans. The name for God is Elohim. Turn to Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. A second creation account begins. Man created first, then animals, then a woman from the man's rib. The name for God is now YHWH, an entirely different name. 2 creation accounts. Different order. Different name for God. Stitched together into one narrative by someone who hoped the scene would not be visible. It is visible. Spinoza identified this pattern throughout the entire Pentateuch. Moses is referred to in the third person. His death is narrated within the books he supposedly wrote. There are anachronisms that only make sense if the text was written after the events it describes. His conclusion, the Pentateuch was compiled by Ezra. the priest-scribe who led Jewish communities after the Babylonian exile, working from earlier source documents. Moses did not write it. The attribution of ancient texts to authoritative figures was standard ancient practice, lending authority to documents whose actual authors were unknown. The Bible contains the religious tradition of the Jewish people, real and valuable, assembled by human beings from human sources over centuries. God is not a person. God is the totality of what exists. Nature and God are the same word for the same reality. The soul does not survive the body. Religion serves a genuine function, moral education for populations who cannot yet access philosophical understanding. But that function is not truth. It is governance in a theological language. And the political argument, the one that made every state authority in Europe add this book to their list of prohibited reading. Freedom of thought is not a danger to civil society. It is its condition. When a state enforces religious uniformity by suppressing dissent, it does not eliminate the dissent. It drives it underground where it cannot be seen, cannot be engaged, cannot be corrected when it is wrong, and cannot be learned from when it is right. The suppression of thought produces the explosion it is designed to prevent. This book was banned immediately. The Catholic Church placed it on the index of forbidden books within a few years of its appearance. Every Protestant authority condemned it. Every Jewish community in Europe condemned it. The Dutch government issued a formal prohibition. For a century after its publication, to be identified as a Spinozist in polite European society was to be identified as an atheist, which in the 17th century meant not a philosophical position, but a civic threat. And here is what I need you to hold in your mind. In July 1656, the congregation Talmud Torah issued a cherem against a 23-year-old for abominable heresies and monstrous deeds, and named not one specific act. In 1670, Baruch de Spinoza published the book that made specific exactly what those heresies were. The Bible is a human document assembled from human sources. God is not a person. The soul does not survive the body. The religious institution is a social mechanism that serves particular interests, which may or may not coincide with the truth, depending on who controls the institution and what they need. The cherem of 1656 was not a punishment. It was a prophecy. They had felt in 1656 the direction his thinking was heading. They could not yet name what he was going to say, hence the empty document. But they could feel the trajectory. They expelled him before he finished saying it. And 14 years later he finished saying it. And it was exactly as dangerous as they had feared. They were right about him. The cherem of July 27, 1656 has never been lifted. Baruch Spinoza died on February 21, 1677. He was 44 years old. Likely he had been breathing ground glass dust for decades, the fine particles of the lens-making trade that settled in the lungs over a working lifetime. He died in his room in The Hague, attended by his friend and physician Georg Hermann Schuller, while his landlord and landlady were at church. He was buried 4 days later in a Dutch Reformed churchyard because no Jewish ground would take him. There was no dramatic deathbed scene in the available record. He had been corresponding with philosophers until weeks before he died. The community that expelled him in 1656 did not lift the ban when he died, or when his collected works were published the following year, or in the century that followed, when his ideas moved through the European Enlightenment like water finding the path of least resistance through stone, slowly, invisibly, reshaping everything. The biblical criticism he pioneered in the Tractatus became the foundation of what is now called historical critical method, the standard scholarly approach to scripture taught in every major seminary in the world that takes its subject seriously. The separation of church and state he argued for became constitutional doctrine across Western democracies. The philosophical understanding of God as the ground of being, rather than a personal lawgiver, became in various forms the working assumption of 100 years of liberal theology. His thinking shaped the world that now exists, and the ban holds. In the early 1950s, David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of the State of Israel, petitioned the community to lift the cherem. He believed Spinoza deserved rehabilitation. The petition was refused. In 2015, a symposium was convened in Amsterdam specifically to revisit the question. Scholars, historians, and philosophers gathered. The chief rabbi of the Portuguese-Jewish community, Pinchas Toledano, attended. He delivered his conclusion. The leaders of the community in the 17th century knew exactly what they were doing. He declined to overturn their decision. I have read that sentence many times since I found it. Knew exactly what they were doing. The rabbi meant it as a defense of the Muhammad's authority. The leaders were wise, deliberate, acting from clear understanding, and his role was not to second-guess them across 3.5 centuries. But every time I read it, I hear something else underneath the official meaning. Yes, they knew exactly what they were doing. They were afraid of a man who would keep thinking to the end of the sentence and say plainly what he found when he got there. They could not argue him back. They could not buy him with a pension. They could not produce a specific charge because the real danger was not an act that had been committed, but an act of thought that had not yet been completed. So they expelled the man before he could complete it. And still, he completed it. He ground lenses. He wrote in rented rooms. He turned down professorships and patronage and the comfort of belonging to anything. He published under no name in a city that was not the city named in the book. He died at 44, with glass dust in his lungs and correspondence on his desk. The institution that expelled him still maintains the expulsion. His ideas are in the foundations of the world you live in. When an institution expels you for dangerous thinking, it is not punishing you. It is admitting you are right, that is the truth of it,